With time running short, it's here. Boris Johnson's long-awaited counter-offer to the EU. The UK Prime Minister writing to the European Commission President with his alternative to the current Brexit divorce deal. Also giving his big speech before the Conservative Party conference. Johnson promises checks moved back from the UK's only land border between the two Irelands. Brussels says, let's talk. Many EU leaders, though, still wonder if he really wants a deal. After all, Johnson's made clear since becoming Prime Minister that his top priority is to win a general election. And until his 11th hour offer, he's been campaigning on a Brexit or bust platform that's taken the Tories away from compassionate conservatism. His Brexit or bust stance, including purges of moderates. Will it be a winning strategy in the end? We'll gauge reactions from Britain, Ireland, and the continent, where France's Emmanuel Macron has led the charge against a Brexit deadline extension unless there's a tangible breakthrough. If Johnson's offer goes nowhere, well, get ready for it. November 1st is less than a month away. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Johnson's final offer. And with us, John Henley, Europe correspondent for broadsheet The Guardian. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Welcome back as well to former EU Commission spokesperson Pierre-Jérôme Hénin, who heads the public relations firm The Progressive Company. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Cambridge University research associate Graham Goodgin, former advisor to the ex-Northern Ireland First Minister David Trimble. Thank you for joining us from London.
My pleasure.
And from Brussels, member of the European Parliament Naomi Long, who heads Northern Ireland's Alliance Party. Welcome to the show.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The UK Prime Minister has been on the phone to Brussels, Dublin, after that big speech before the party faithful in Manchester. More from Cole Stangler.
Refusing to back down to his critics, Prime Minister Boris Johnson reiterated his call for the UK to leave the European Union by the end of the month.
That is why we are coming out of the EU on October the 31st, come what may. Let's get Brexit done. We can, we must, and we will.
Johnson said the UK has submitted a new offer to the EU, and it addresses the hotly contested issue of the Irish border.
And today in Brussels, we are tabling what I believe are constructive and reasonable proposals, which provide a compromise for both sides. Yes, this is a compromise by the UK, and I hope very much that our friends understand that and compromise in their turn.
In the Prime Minister's proposal, which was light on details, a commitment to avoid all border checks at or near the Irish border, and an extension of EU regulations to Northern Ireland, pending approval from the province's legislature, all the while keeping the territory in a customs union with the UK, not the EU. The speech to Conservative Party members comes ahead of high-pressure talks with the European Union, slated to begin on October 17th. But amid the threat of a no-deal Brexit, British Parliament has taken action of its own. It's passed a law requiring Johnson to request an extension of the Brexit deadline if he can't reach a deal with the EU by October 19th. The Prime Minister hasn't yet specified how he'd comply with that law.
John Henley, the UK Prime Minister, who's spoken to Jean-Claude Juncker, as we saw in that report after that letter he sent. He's also spoken to the German Chancellor, to the Irish Prime Minister. And we're hearing the first reactions are from Brussels are, let's look at this constructively, but we're also hearing the main EU negotiator, Michel Barnier, saying, to be frank, lots of work still needs to be done to meet the conditions of the EU. Your thoughts on this point?
Yeah, I mean, it was never likely that the EU were going to kind of slam the door shut on this. The moment the proposition was made, they've been waiting for it for sort of a few months now. Their interest is in getting a deal, every bit as much as Britain's interest is in getting a deal. So certainly the EU door will remain open. they'll want to keep talking. But as things stand, I mean, this proposal that was made today by the British government is a very, very long way from being acceptable to the European Union. I don't think there should be any doubt about that. I mean, it was the starting point was that there can be no hard border across the across the island of Ireland between the Republic in the south and Northern Ireland in the north. This effectively creates two borders, right? I mean, it creates a customs border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic, which no matter what the British government says will have to be policed. There will have to be checks and controls somewhere. And it creates a kind of a regulatory border down the middle of the Irish Sea for sort of agri-food and manufactured goods. And none of that comes anywhere near meeting the objectives of the famous backstop, the Northern Ireland backstop that is a key part of the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated over 2 years.
Still, it's something concrete in writing. Do you think that because effectively, if you've got that EU summit taking place in just 15 days' time, you need to have something. You need to move those negotiations along within the next 2 weeks. Is that possible?
You do. I personally, and this is the opinion of most of the sort of Brussels commentators that I've been hearing this afternoon, I don't see any way how a deal can actually be done between now and the EU summit on the 17th and the 18th of October. I mean, you know, what the British government today has done is say, okay, let's take a really crucial part of the withdrawal agreement, which, as I say, took 2 years to negotiate. Let's rip it out, completely change it, come up with something utterly new, and expect to renegotiate that in 2 weeks. I mean, I can't really see it happening.
Can't see it happening? Graham Gudgeon, is it too late?
No, I don't think so. I think this is a reasonable compromise. If the EU doesn't accept it, I think it'll be an example of intransigence, and we'll have to move to no deal. We're not quite sure how we get to no deal, given what the British Parliament has done recently, but that's very much Boris Johnson's intention. But this is a reasonable way forward, and I think Brussels should give it fair attention. The main thing is it does the job. It protects the single market, which is the main aim of the European Union. Tariff checks will be done electronically, as they are in most places in the world. And checks, regulatory checks, particularly on animals and food, can be done at producers' premises. Again, quite a normal procedure. Sources
that are Europe editor has been speaking to say that those electronic checks, they're just not in place yet. Can all this happen by November the 1st?
Yes, I think so. It's just a matter of firms completing their customs declarations online. They've had plenty of information. There are government websites to explain how to do this. There is an extra element to this, which is the European transit system, whereby firms give notice to the system when their lorries leave the factory or the warehouse. And have to report back in when they reach their final destination. Again, that's pretty standard procedure. I mean, that's what happens across the Swiss border, for instance. And again, the technology is there.
Naomi Long, do you agree? Naomi Long, do you agree that it is possible to do this deal, and it is possible to use technology?
I don't agree that the technology is there. I don't agree that the technology is there, but moreover, I don't agree that this is a proposal aimed at actually getting agreement by the time of the European Council. I think that the Prime Minister actually wants to see a no-deal Brexit. I think that he is captive of those within his own party and indeed those in the country who want a no-deal Brexit, or as they prefer to call it, a clean Brexit, as we see it, a catastrophic Brexit. So from that perspective, I think that this is a chance to put forward proposals which he knows to be unworkable, table, and the devil is in the detail of these proposals in the hope that they will be rejected. And I'm glad that the European Union haven't simply rejected those proposals out of hand. I'm glad that they're going to continue the discussions and try and drill into that detail, because it's within that detail that I think the real problems emerge. Giving, for example, the Northern Ireland Assembly a veto over whether or not we continue as part of the single energy market and part of the single market would fly in the face of international treaties and law, and would also place a ridiculous burden on a local assembly that hasn't been able to sit for 3 years. Now, I think even in that sense, it's not a reasonable or constructive proposal, but there are many other problems with it, the technology being one of the least.
Yeah, that Northern Ireland Assembly has been gridlocked and hasn't met since January of 2017. At this point in time, could there be some coming together? Your political party is all about bringing those two sides together.
Yes, we are, and we have tried very hard over the last 3 years to put forward proposals to be able to bring people back around the table and to have the Good Friday Agreement functioning. We believe that it has been to Northern Ireland's detriment during this Brexit process, that we haven't been able to have a coherent assembly, able to put forward clear positions around what matters in Northern Ireland in terms of business, community, civic society and the Good Friday Agreement. But the reality is that to try and do in 2 weeks what we have failed to do in 3 years, a bit like Brexit itself, seems to me to be a tough order, and I cannot see all of the pieces coming together in time. The Assembly is fragile. It has been fragile since its inception, and I think that realistically giving any section of the community a veto over how our future would be determined could be incredibly destructive. But moreover, this would give a small section of our community a veto over the Irish economy and the Irish position. Now, I'm not sure that the Irish government would be happy with the Northern Ireland Assembly assuming that kind of power over the single market on the island of Ireland and over the Irish integrated economy with Northern Ireland. So I think that this is fraught with difficulties, and I think it also overlooks the reality of the situation for many of the businesses in Northern Ireland. Many small businesses, our average size is around 7 people per business in our small and medium business sector. And this would put a huge burden in terms of bureaucracy and paperwork on them, one that would inevitably either put them out of business or force those pressures, those financial pressures, onto the consumer. And that's not good for Northern Ireland business.
Not good for Northern Ireland business. Pierre-Jérôme Ménin, at this point, when you hear, we've had tough talk from Paris, right? Emmanuel Macron. When you hear Naomi Long discuss how the problem could be very real for those in Dublin, well, just letting the clock run out, is that a responsible thing to do?
If you allow me, for once, I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic, especially more optimistic than John. I think there is still enough time to reach a deal before the next stages, which is the next European Summit around the 18th of October.
17th and 18th.
And then the date of the 19th of October, which is the deadline reached by the British Parliament, House of Commons, to make sure that there's another delay which shall be compulsory if no agreement is reached by that date, and of course the 31st of October. You have two things. You have the political issue and the technical issue. Of course, we can discuss, and I'm not a specialist of these technical issues. It will be up to Mr. Barnier and his team and the people from the Commission and several member states to say whether on a technical basis it is feasible. We don't have the answer yet, and we're still waiting for other reactions from the Commission. Then you have the political issue. Yes, it is a sort of a good news that happened today in an ocean of bad news about the European construction. It is a political move. It is a door that has been opened and that breaks a silence that had been lasting for weeks and months, as John stated it. So it's a good thing. It focuses the problems of the Brexit on the Irish issue, so it makes things very clear. The Irish issue is the only issue to be discussed, and once again we'll see whether it can be feasible for the technical thing. And then we see as a political issue that Boris Johnson has been able to fit his own domestic political agenda within the Brexit issue. So his purpose is certainly to reach an agreement, by the end of the month.
Because that's not what Naomi Long says. She says his purpose is not to reach an agreement. That's not what he cares about.
I think that he wants to remain in the British history as a great prime minister who has taken his country out of the Brexit, which has lasted for 3.5 years, taken the Brexit issue, solved it in a way, maintained the integrity of the territory, then provoke general elections and win them. That is his domestic political agenda.
All right, we're going to look at that domestic political agenda. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Boris Johnson has laid his cards on the table, sending to the European Union his proposal to solve that question of the Irish backstop, and hoping to do so in time before that October 31st deadline for leaving the European Union. We're talking about it with John Henley, Europe correspondent for newspaper The Guardian. Joining us as well, former EU Commission spokesperson Pierre-Jérôme Hénin, who heads public relations firm The Progressive Company. Cambridge University research associate Graham Goodgen is a former advisor to ex-Northern Ireland First Minister David Trimble. And from Brussels, member of the European Parliament, Naomi Long, who heads the Alliance Party. It's interesting because just before the break, Pierre-Jérôme Hénin was talking about the two calculuses, that is to say, negotiations with Brussels and domestic politics. There's going to be a general election in the UK sooner rather than later. And while the Labour Party held its fall conference in the southeast, in Brighton, the Tories chose Manchester. Now, Manchester is Labour country. As this map of the 2017 election results show, it's that part in red you see in the middle there. Boris Johnson talking up issues that matter to those aging Labour voters in the north, particularly in defense of the National Health Service.
Because after 70 years of the existence of the NHS, 44 of them under a Conservative government, it is time for us to say loud and clear, we are the party of the NHS.
The Conservatives, are they the party of the NHS, John Henry?
Well, they've overseen many years now of austerity and of spending cuts on the NHS. I mean, you know, it was a pretty boilerplate speech from Johnson, I think. Nothing really exceptional. No real meat on the bones of a pretty standard, Conservative Party discourse.
Except you see the Conservative Party courting those Northern Labour voters, it seems, with remarks like that one.
Well, I mean, he knows there is an election coming. That's certainly true. I mean, there has to be an election. The position at the moment is obviously untenable. I mean, he had a tiny majority when he took office, which he's subsequently lost, not helped, of course, by the fact that he fired, 21 of his own MPs who voted against him last month. There will have to be an election. The only question is, when will that come, and how will it be triggered? I mean, I think this is the interesting question. Because it's very important to remember that as well from the EU's point of view when it comes to getting a deal. The EU, I think, will be reluctant. The EU27 will be reluctant to rubber stamp any kind of paper deal as long as there is there is absolutely no majority in Westminster in the British Parliament to get that through. And I think we could very well be looking at a scenario where there is no deal reached by the 19th, by the 17th. The deadline actually has to be earlier than that because you can't actually hammer out a deal at an EU summit. That never happens. These things have to be agreed beforehand by the Sherpas so that the heads of state and government can sign off on them. So, it's highly unlikely, in my view, to be a deal by then, in which case Boris Johnson, who, as you said, was, rightly said, is obliged to go to the EU27 27 and ask for a new extension, a new Brexit extension, something that he has sworn he would rather die in a ditch than do. So at some stage between now and then, either he's going to have to resign or there will be a motion of no confidence in the House of Commons. Somebody else will have to go to Brussels and ask for the extension, and then Parliament will be dissolved and elections.
And then he can perhaps return triumphantly after those elections?
I mean, the polls at the moment give him a 12-point lead over Labour, so he certainly desperately wants those elections.
Yeah, the Durham City Workmen's Club, everyone's got an opinion. It's a pub in the northeast constituency where the outgoing Labour MP won handily in the last general election in 2017, but which voted for leave in the Brexit referendum.
I'm quite happy to come out without a deal, and I think most of the North East want to come out without a deal. I think the Conservatives are all for London down the south, and I think they're forgetting about the North East.
We voted for it, so why are they messing about? Just get on with it and go. And yes, it's going to be problems, but in the long run, I think Britain will be great again.
I think it'll affect the North East very deeply. We rely so much on exports and manufacturing. If we don't have those markets available to us in the same way as they are at the moment, then I think this area will suffer more than most.
Pierre-Jérôme Hénin, we are witnessing a shift in the political landscape in the UK. Your reaction to that?
I'm not a specialist of the relationship between the NHS and the Conservative Party. All I do remember is the arguments used by the pro-Brexit during the campaign 3.5 years ago, saying that a lot of money would come back from the EU for the NHS. I don't see whether they have seen much of that money. No, clearly Boris Johnson is playing a domestic political agenda, pretty smartly as far as I can see things from a communication point of view, and on a very particular topic, which is, once again, the backstop and the Irish situation. Seriously, no one understands anymore what is really at stake for this backstop, and certainly not the public opinion. So he can say more or less whatever he wants to say. His technical proposition will have to be checked by the Commission and checked to see that it does not cross the red lines, meaning no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
All right. There's two Boris Johnsons, aren't there, Graham Goodgen? There's the one who, during his speech, said, "Come what may, we're leaving on October 31st." And there's the one who wants a place in history, as Pierre-Jérôme Hénin just described it. Right now, which is the real Boris Johnson?
Oh, I think there's just one Boris Johnson, and they're the same person. He wants his place in history by leaving the EU on the 31st, which he's promised to do and is desperate to do. And that, by the way, is why Naomi Long is exactly wrong on this. I mean, she's a well-known opponent of Brexit, and she always sees the most negative and pessimistic in people's motives. But it's clearly in Boris Johnson's interest to get a deal, because that's the easiest and most certain way for him to actually be able to take the UK out of the EU on the 31st. He does want an election. NHS spending is a large part of that. Again, John Henry was quite wrong to say there have been cuts in the NHS budget. There have been no cuts at all. Indeed, no party in the UK cut the NHS budget, because the NHS is the nearest thing we have in the UK to a state religion. So there's really one Boris Johnson. He wants to take the UK swiftly out of the EU, and he then wants an election which he's confident of winning.
Graham, you were an advisor to David Trimble, who is at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. Are you worried for what no deal on the 31st would mean for Northern Ireland?
No, not really. But there are some quite important and large economic and financial problems, particularly for the agricultural industry. For instance, a third of the milk produced in Northern Ireland is actually processed across the border in the Republic of Ireland. And if we come out with no deal and there are large tariffs on milk, that will present a really quite severe problem. Now, the UK government is ready to deal with that. Compensation will be offered to farmers, subsidies. Farmers won't go out of business. Measures will be taken. But it's something I think that everyone would want to avoid, and of course, including Boris Johnson, and that's why he wants this deal.
And that's why he wants his deal. Naomi Long, again, you said in part one of our discussion that he's not interested in a deal.
Well, I don't believe that he is, and I think Graham's quite incorrect to say that we're always negative and taking a dark view of things. We actually supported Theresa May's withdrawal agreement and backstop, so that's a factually incorrect position that he's taken, and that was a compromise for our party because we would prefer to remain within the European Union. But what Boris Johnson wants to be, on top of being Prime Minister, which is the only thing that Boris Johnson cares about, is he wants to be liked. And so if he can manage not to get a deal, that will satisfy those ultra-Brexiteers within his own party. It will satisfy the Brexit Party people who don't want a deal and will save him having any competition in that election. And it will also mean if unfortunately, France play games and kind of put it up to the British to make a decision, then he will also have his enemy because he will be able to lay the blame for what follows from no deal at the door of the French and the EU. So I think everyone needs to take a step back, understand the person that Boris Johnson is, understand his motivation, and then need to think very carefully about how to ensure that he has to take responsibility for the decisions that he is making. Because Graham talks a lot there about the economy, and the economy in Northern Ireland is hugely important. But the Good Friday Agreement is about more than the economy. It is about people's identity and sense of place. And Brexit, in its most raw form, affects people's sense of identity and sense of place. And the ignoring of that persistently by the government is one of the fundamental challenges to the Good Friday Agreement and fundamental challenges to the integrity of the UK. If the UK is like a family, two members of that family are unhappy with leaving. And what we are seeing from the British government is a form of leave which is the most extreme form. Now, in any family, if you disregard two members of your family, you won't have family around you for very long. And that's the simple situation that we face in the UK today. And so I come from a party that doesn't take a position either unionist or nationalist, but I can see the tide on the ground shifting because of Brexit. And Graham is wrong to ignore the fact that people are becoming more and more frustrated with the lack of sensitivity being shown around the Good Friday Agreement and around issues of identity in Northern Ireland.
The ground shifting, how so? Just briefly tell us.
Well, if you look at all the polls in Northern Ireland that have been conducted, it shows very clearly that the harder the Brexit, the more likely we are, first of all, to have a referendum on a united Ireland, and the more likely people are to vote for that. So that there's a direct correlation between how hard Brexit is and how likely people are to shift their opinion towards a united Ireland. Now, that's been consistent in a number of polls now over a long period of time. So you can't ignore the fact that the links between Brexit and people's level of satisfaction in the United Kingdom are linked. And so without wanting to get into the minutiae of Northern Ireland politics, the reality is that this is not a good time for Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was based around the assumption that the UK and Ireland would continue with convergence through the European Union. Borders would become less important and less of an issue. And through that, we would have stability. We would have this ambiguity around our status in terms of our identity. So people can be fully British, fully Irish and both. And there's no challenge in that in the Good Friday Agreement. Once you choose a path, and Boris Johnson was very specific in his letter today, when you choose a path, not just of exiting the EU, but of active divergence within that market, then you are choosing a path that immediately starts to pull people apart. And you can't ignore the social implications of that. There are economic implications and they're significant, but there are social and political implications,
for the Northern
and
Irish.
those cannot be ignored either.
It can't be ignored either. Pierre-Jérôme Ménard, most French people, when you ask them about this, they don't understand the backstop. It seems really technical and complicated. How high are the stakes for the European Union in this?
It is everybody's interest to reach a deal. It is Boris Johnson's interest. It is the British people's interest. It is the countries, the other 27 countries interest, to reach a deal. It has been lasting for 3.5 years. We are just fed up with this situation. President Macron has stated it very clearly. We have to leave that story behind us. There's a new commission that will start its work on the 1st of November. There is a new European Parliament. We want this subject to be behind us. There are plenty of more interesting things to deal with for the future of Europe, for the future of the population, the climate change, the immigration issues. We want to go back to these real issues and have the Brexit issue behind us. So let's make things such as we can reach a deal as soon as possible and before the 31st of October.
Yeah, but you're hearing Emmanuel Macron saying, well, we're over this. We're beyond this, he's almost saying. Is that the wrong thing to be saying, though?
No, it's not a wrong thing to say. He has a lot of projects for the European Union. He's the head of state able to conduct things. A lot of European states are going through political internal difficulties.
Yeah, but he'd be leaving Northern Ireland in the lurch if the European Union just says, all right, no deal, that's it, over.
No, we will see. We will see how it goes. Everybody, and I think he's the first one to hope that a deal can be reached. But the more important thing is to make sure that the new Commission can work with the Brexit issue behind and not ahead.
I think Pierre-Jérôme is absolutely right. The EU 27 absolutely want to put Brexit
will
behind
not be
them.
Behind us.
No, well, Naomi Long is absolutely right there, and that Brexit we are entering. I mean, Brexit is now for eternity. Brexiternity is where we're heading, and which is what makes this idea of a no deal Brexit the Brexiters call it the clean Brexit, and they say at least it'll be over, it'll be behind us. It really won't be. It'll be the start of decades of negotiation, just like Switzerland, just like Norway. These countries are in permanent negotiation with the EU. And just one final point, where I also agree with Naomi, is this idea that I think there will be real difficulty getting a deal. And I think this is a point for Graham as well. There will be real difficulty getting a deal with the EU as long as the British government continues to say, as it did today, that this is essentially a technical issue. For the EU 27, the Irish border is partly a technical issue, but it is much, much more than that.
It's a political issue.
It is about peace. It is about the Good Friday Agreement. It is about the integrity of the single market. And until British officials and government ministers stop saying this, we can sort this out with, wizard technology, it's all easy, we can do it, then, a deal will be very hard to reach.
Yes, it is a political issue, and you are absolutely right to stress it. But please, let's make things such as we can reach a success, that we can have the Brexit behind us and not being stuck again for months and months with this issue that pollutes the European debate. When you open a newspaper today, looking at the European Union section, what do you have for the news? You have the Brexit, and you have 2 commissioners that have been refused by the European Parliament. These are all the news that we can bring to the European people. I think they deserve something else.
All right, Graham Goodgen, do you agree with John Henley that, of course, when you say no deal Brexit, it doesn't mean no deal, because after November 1st, you then have to negotiate a deal?
Well, it should be very easy in principle, to negotiate a deal. The UK wants a free trade deal, and if we have a free trade agreement, this will be the world's first free trade agreement between 2 countries which already have free trade. I mean, just how difficult can that be? Now, it may be difficult because the EU is making everything difficult. It resents the UK leaving, and it doesn't want any other country to leave, and it may well pose all sorts of problems in the way of a free trade agreement. But if they do that, there's not a great deal we can do about it. We'll get on and join other organisations.
I think the EU is simply protecting its own interests.
That includes most of the English-speaking world.
John Henley?
Well, the EU 27 is simply protecting its own interests. The integrity of the single market, although I completely agree with Pierre-Jérôme, obviously that's the case, that it's in the European Union's, that a deal is better than no deal. But ultimately, for the European Union, protecting the integrity of the single market, they see that, rightly or wrongly, but they see that as much more important to their future than the departure of Britain.
Last week, we saw the Supreme Court with that landmark ruling overturning prorogation. We've just had news that the Prime Minister is to suspend Parliament the week of the 8th to the 14th. That's the week before that EU Council summit. In other words, next week. Is that standard procedure?
It is standard procedure. Will probably be found to be legal, I imagine, if it is even challenged. I'm not sure whether it will be challenged. It is standard procedure for a government to suspend Parliament ahead of a new Queen's speech, and Boris Johnson is probably within his rights to do that. What it will do is really put the pressure on the opposition, the sort of the alliance in Parliament, to make sure that they really nail down, which is their interest at the moment, really nail down and completely exclude the possibility of Boris Johnson taking Britain out without a deal on the 31st.
Naomi Long, we've heard what you had to say about Boris Johnson's intentions. What do you make of the UK's opposition?
Well, I mean, we're in a very difficult position at the moment because we have a government which has a minority and very little in the way of authority in Parliament, and we have a very weak opposition and one that doesn't really garner fulsome support even from the other parties who are also in opposition, and that's a very difficult position for the country to be in. But I do want to come back on one thing. This notion of getting Brexit behind us, getting Brexit done, is a fallacy. When we leave the European Union as the UK, there is going to be a lot of work to be done in future years, and the impact of Brexit will continue to be felt for a long time. The idea that we simply leave and it stops is an absolute fallacy, and I want to really stress, if people don't understand around Europe why it matters to them what happens with the UK, let me be really clear about it. If the UK economy tanks, the Irish economy is completely intertwined with it, and it will go down too. And if the Irish economy does badly, that will infect the rest of the European Union economy. And if people's economy is being hit in the EU, which is already teetering on the brink of a recession, then it could push the EU into a recession. Now, that will affect people's view of the EU. We know that the mess that Brexit has been has dissuaded a lot of the other exit movements in other countries around Europe from considering leaving the EU. But an economic crash in the EU could destabilise the EU further still. So I would appeal to those who think that this is about getting this behind us, getting on to other projects. Emmanuel Macron making a name for himself politically in terms of Europe. I would appeal to them to think long and hard, because if the EU is damaged by Britain's messy exit from the EU, it is not in their long-term interests. And I would also ask them to consider what message it sends out to those of us who are EU citizens and who are passionately EU citizens if we're simply abandoned at a point where we desperately need that support.
Naomi Long, I want to thank you for joining us today from Brussels. I want to thank Graham Gudgeon for being with us from London. Pierre-Jérôme Hénin, John Henley. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So we'll look at some reactions online to the day's developments. A lot of people tracking the various developments. We will start with an Oxford professor of politics, Dr. Jennifer Cassidy, who has become a very prolific tweeter on the subject of Brexit. Johnson's letter to Juncker on the UK's Brexit border proposal. You guessed it, nothing new, she says. He's still demanding the backstop be scrapped and will not agree to it on any terms. Also, media, please stop calling it the Irish border. It's a UK border imposed on the island of Ireland. So that's one reaction coming through. Peter Foster of the Daily Telegraph, Europe editor for the Daily Telegraph, says, look, this proposal, look at the EU red lines. You've got which are fully open border, preserving north-south cooperation on the island of Ireland, integrity of the single market. How can this possibly be squared with the UK request? And he adds, he understands that Dominic Cummings, who is of course one of the main advisors and architects indeed of Brexit for Boris Johnson's government, he understands that Dominic Cummings told a meeting of top advisors last Friday that the UK won't be hanging around to negotiate. If they reject our offer, that's it. So that's a sort of if you like, behind-the-scenes peek into what the mentality might be behind redacting a text that is very likely to be rejected.
Yeah, and we've heard the initial reaction from the Irish Prime Minister saying that it doesn't fully meet demands, which, in other words, there is room for bargaining.
Right. It's not the harshest response that could have been, but many people online speculating that the text is designed to be rejected so we can blame the EU and Parliament for rejecting it. I suppose that's been a common theory all along with the hard Brexit position. But this is a pro-Brexit Twitter account. When we leave without a deal and blame lies with the EU, not the UK, this letter will be exhibited as evidence. We tried to be reasonable with the EU, but the EU refuses to be reasonable in return. They are fanatics and fundamentalists who haven't and never will negotiate. Proof that there is more than one position on social media when it comes to
view.
A point of view. Michael Dugan here is Professor of European Law at the University of Liverpool. Her Majesty, this is a thread, but just picking out one element in it, the British government repeats a sort of fantasy border-free trade model that we've been listening to from Brexiteers for years, based on electronic monitoring, physical inspections along supply chains and trusted trader schemes, special exemptions for small traders, etc. So in other words, it's sort of fantasy stuff. If you go to the Northern Ireland Manufacturing Association on Twitter, they're really negative about this. The Boris plan unveiled today means that tariffs going from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, meaning farms, agri-food, that will all be decimated. It also means two borders require renewal after 4 years. All of this gets very technical, but if you just go down through that thread, I think this is kind of the conclusion to take on board. Frankly, the proposals are worse than no deal for Northern Ireland businesses. In other words, for small businesses, this is utterly disastrous. This is somebody who, I think, tongue-in-cheek, put up a quote-unquote infographic of what this will involve. Roaming customs officers randomly stop and search on both sides of the border to keep system honest and catch smugglers. Because, of course, the whole thing...
Hold on. I love this. The little...
Yeah.
Right. He's
actually a leading trade expert. I mean, he's quite an authority.
That's right. Sam Lowe is, as you know, we all love infographics. This is roughly how the Johnson plan for customs checks on the Irish border will work. Now, the reason why that is all relevant is because of this whole notion of two borders, one down along the Irish Sea and then another one. So this is the Irish border, me meeting all the new Irish borders. That is actually a satirical account that's been picking up on this a lot over the last while. In any case, so much more to say on this, but the whole point here being customs posts are not possible politically and historically. We can't go back, says one Irish senator. You have to protect the Good Friday Agreement in this regard, which the deal, according to Boris Johnson, does, but most people would agree doesn't. Lots of fun on Twitter over the last day or two as well about the idea that there could be border posts 10 kilometres back. Which some people compared to the Korean demilitarised zone, also tongue-in-cheek, but it looks like that's not going to happen now. Anyway, the eternal question, how will it be resolved?
How will it be resolved?
Question.
We may know before the end of the month, or not.
Yes, yeah.
Many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.